know you have heard of serial killers before, but have you heard of a man who confessed to over 300 murders and vanished? No one knows if he's alive or dead. What about a doctor whom a community trusted with their lives, only to turn around and systematically murder 250 of his patients? For decades, nobody stopped him. We're about to show you the 10 deadliest serial killers in history, but here's what the media won't tell you. Their victim counts aren't the most disturbing part. It's who they targeted, and who society allowed them to kill without any public outcry. Watch this video to the end, because the last serial killer's story will make you question your conscience. Thanks for clicking on this video, and please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with our latest videos. Also, drop a comment sharing where you're watching from. Let's see which country has the most viewers. Number 1. Javed Iqbal from Pakistan. Responsible for 100 murders. Javed Iqbal, with 100 proven victims, stands as one of the most horrifying cases in South Asian criminal history, remarkable not just for the number of children he killed, but for the cold, methodical way he documented his crimes. Javed Iqbal Mughal was born in 1961 in Lahore, Punjab, Pakistan. He was the sixth of 8 children born to a wealthy businessman. He grew up in Lahore's affluent circles and attended Government Islamia College as an intermediate student. In 1978, while still a student, he started a steel recasting business. His father purchased a villa for him in the Altar area of the city, where Iqbal lived along with several young boys. From the outside, Iqbal appeared successful and respectable. He came from money, ran a business, and seemed to be a productive member of society. But beneath this veneer prowled something atrocious, something that would eventually reveal itself in the most horrific way imaginable. According to Iqbal's later confession, his motivation for killing stemmed from a perceived injustice. In the 1990s, he had been arrested on charges relating to sodomy against a young runaway boy. The victim of this sexual assault had severely beaten Iqbal, predominantly about the head, rendering him unconscious. Though no charges were brought in relation to this offense, Iqbal's mother was forced to watch his decline in status and reputation. She suffered a fatal heart attack, which Iqbal attributed to the shame and stress of seeing her son accused of such crimes. In Iqbal's twisted logic, his mother's death, after watching his social, economic, and symbolic status deteriorate following his attack and arrest, had broken a hell over him. He resolved to make 100 mothers suffer and cry for their sons, just as his late mother had been forced to cry for him. It was revenge taken out on innocent children who had nothing to do with his own trauma. Between late 1998 and 1999, Javed Iqbal embarked on one of the most systematic killing sprees in history. He targeted vulnerable homeless children and street children living on the streets of Lahore, boys between the ages of 6 and 16. These were children from the absolute margins of society, children nobody would miss, children whose disappearances would barely register in a city where homeless kids were essentially invisible. Iqbal's method was both simple and horrifying. He would lure the boys to his villa with promises of food, shelter, or work. Once he had them inside, he would sexually assault them. After the abuse, he would strangle each child to death. But Iqbal didn't stop there. He dismembered their bodies, then dissolved the remains in large vats of hydrochloric acid to destroy any evidence. Once the bodies were completely dissolved, he would dump the acidic liquid containing what remained of his victims into a local river. Iqbal was meticulous in his record-keeping. He documented everything. He kept photographs of many of his victims in plastic bags, each carefully labeled with name written on handwritten pamphlets. He maintained a detailed journal where he recorded information about each murder, tracking his progress toward his goal of 100 victims, like a businessman tracking sales figures. In December 1999, after claiming to have reached his target of 100 murdered children, Iqbal did something extraordinary and chilling. He sent letters to the police and to Kawar Naeem Hashmi, a chief news editor of a Lahore newspaper, confessing to everything. In the letters, he provided explicit details about his crimes. He wrote that he had strangled and dismembered the victims, who were mostly runaways or orphans living on the streets of Lahore, after sexually assaulting them. He explained how he had disposed of their bodies using vats of hydrochloric acid, then emptied the vats into local rivers. But Iqbal didn't just confess. He provided evidence. He left his house open for police to investigate, and what they found there was beyond comprehension. Inside the villa, police and reporters discovered bloodstains on the walls and floor. They found the chain Iqbal claimed to have used to strangle the boys. They found the photographs of his victims in plastic bags, all neatly labeled. 2 vats of acid were still present, containing partially dissolved human remains. Most disturbing was a note Iqbal had left, claiming that he had deliberately not disposed of these bodies so that authorities would find them. He wanted to ensure his message was received, that his crimes were properly documented and understood. One of the final entries in his journal read, "My count has reached 100. He was a handsome 16-year-old boy. He came from Peshawar. With the grace of God, my mission is complete." Tears roll down my cheeks. I will make sure that my mission and my message reach the world. In his confession letter, Iqbal also revealed his initial plan. He wrote that after completing his mission, he intended to drown himself in the Ravi River. Police dragged the river with nets, launching the largest manhunt in Pakistani history, but found nothing. Within days, 4 of Iqbal's accomplices were arrested in Sohawa. These were teenage boys who had shared Iqbal's 3-bedroom flat, and according to reports, they had helped him in his crimes. One of them died in police custody within days. A post-mortem suggested that force had been used against him, though police claimed he had jumped from a window of his own accord. For a month, Javed Iqbal remained at large. Authorities assumed he had either drowned in the river or fled the country. But on December 30th, 1999, Iqbal made another unexpected move. He turned himself in at the offices of the Daily Jang newspaper. He stated that he had surrendered to the newspaper because he feared for his life and was concerned that police would kill him if he turned himself in directly to them. The trial of Javed Iqbal became one of the most closely watched in Pakistani history. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Beyond his own confession, police had the photographs, the journals, the partially dissolved remains, and testimony from survivors who had managed to escape. The sheer scale of his crimes shocked the entire country. Pakistan had never seen anything like this before. On March 16, 2000, the judge delivered a verdict that was as shocking as the crimes themselves. Iqbal was found guilty and sentenced to death, but the manner of execution prescribed was extraordinary. The judge stated, "You will be strangled to death in front of the parents whose children you killed. Your body will then be cut into 100 pieces and put in acid, the same way you killed the children." This sentence immediately sparked controversy. Pakistan's Interior Minister Moinuddin Haider contradicted it, stating that Pakistan was a signatory of the Human Rights Commission and that such punishments were not allowed. The sentence raised profound questions about justice versus vengeance, about whether the state should mirror the crimes of the criminals it punishes, and about the limits of judicial punishment, even for the most heinous offenses. Ultimately, the question of how Iqbal's sentence would be carried out became controversial. On October 9, 2001, Javed Iqbal and his accomplice Sajid Ahmed were found dead in their respective cells at Kot Lakhpat jail. Officially, they were ruled to have hanged themselves with their own bedsheets. However, autopsies revealed that both men had been beaten prior to death. The circumstances of their deaths raised immediate suspicions. Many believed they had been murdered by other inmates, or possibly even by prison guards, who felt justice had not been served quickly enough. Iqbal's body went unclaimed. None of his family members came forward to retrieve it or arrange for burial. He had become so reviled, even his own relatives wanted nothing to do with his remains. The case of Javed Iqbal exposed horrifying truths about Pakistani society and cities across the developing world. The fact that 100 children could disappear from the streets of Lahore without triggering a major investigation earlier revealed how invisible street children were to authorities and the general public. These were children living in extreme poverty, many of them runaways or orphans, surviving through begging or petty crime. To society at large, they were nearly invisible, and their absence barely registered. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of children in a society where social safety nets were virtually non-existent for the poorest citizens. Iqbal deliberately targeted children from the absolute margins because he knew nobody would miss them, report them missing, or investigate their disappearances with any urgency. He was right. Despite killing 100 children over the course of about a year, no alarm was raised until he himself confessed. This raises troubling questions about how many other predators might be operating in similar circumstances, targeting vulnerable children whose disappearances go unnoticed and uninvestigated. Iqbal's case was only exposed because he chose to confess. If he had remained silent, would anyone have ever connected the disappearances? Would anyone have cared enough to look? The psychology of Javed Iqbal is difficult to comprehend. His stated motive was revenge for his mother's death, which he blamed on the shame brought by his earlier arrest. But this explanation, while provided by Iqbal himself, doesn't fully account for the scale and systematic nature of his crimes. Killing 100 children as revenge for one death suggests something far beyond simple vengeance. It suggests a profound hatred, a complete absence of empathy, and a capacity for sustained violence that is almost incomprehensible. Some psychologists who studied the case suggested that Iqbal's sexual abuse of the children was his primary motivation, and the revenge narrative was a way to rationalize or give meaning to crimes that were fundamentally about power and sexual gratification. The fact that he documented everything so carefully, keeping trophies and maintaining detailed records, suggests someone who took pride in his actions, who wanted to remember and perhaps relive his crimes through his documentation. In 2023, a film based on Javed Iqbal, titled Javed Iqbal, The Untold Story of a Serial Killer, was produced, chronicling his trial. The film faced significant controversy and was initially banned by the Punjab government and the Central Board of Film Censors due to its portrayal of government and police. It was removed from cinemas a day before its scheduled release. After public backlash and support from several actors, it was finally released on June 2, 2023. The Javed Iqbal case stands as one of the most disturbing in criminal history. 100 families lost their sons before the killer himself decided to confess. That is perhaps the most haunting aspect of this entire case. If you can't stand when society ignores its most vulnerable, subscribe and share this video to create more awareness in our journey of protecting helpless children that nobody else seems to care about. Number 2. Alexander Pichushkin from Russia. Killed between 49 to 63 people. Alexander Pichushkin from Russia, with 49 confirmed victims and claims of up to 63 stands as one of the most notorious killers in Russian history, known for his calculated violence and his chilling goal of filling every square on a chessboard with victims. Alexander Yurievich Pichushkin was born on April 9, 1974, in Mytishchi, Moscow Oblast. He grew up in a two-bedroom apartment on Kersenskaya Street in Moscow with his mother Natalia, his younger half-sister, her husband, and their son. The apartment building was just a 6-minute walk from the north end of Bitsa Park, the place that would eventually become his primary hunting ground. Pichushkin was remembered as an initially sociable child, but everything changed following a tragic accident. He fell backwards off a swing, and as it swung back, it struck him in the forehead. This head injury would have profound consequences. Experts later speculated that this event damaged the frontal cortex of Pichushkin's brain, damage known to produce poor impulse regulation and a tendency toward aggression. Since Pichushkin was still a child when it happened, the damage would have been more severe. As a child's forehead provides only a fraction of the protection for the brain that an adult's does. Following this accident, Pichushkin frequently became hostile and impulsive. Due to his behavioral changes, Pichushkin's mother decided to transfer him from mainstream school to one for children with learning disabilities. At his previous school, children had physically and verbally bullied him, referring to him as retard. This abuse intensified Pichushkin's anger and sense of alienation. His maternal grandfather, recognizing that the boy was highly intelligent despite his behavioral issues, took him in and encouraged him to pursue intellectual activities outside of school. The deepest of these interests was chess. Pichushkin's grandfather taught him how to play, and the boy demonstrated remarkable ability. He was introduced to exhibition games against elderly men who played publicly in Bitsa Park. Pichushkin proved to be an outstanding chess player and found a channel for his aggression when dominating the chessboard in all of his games. However, he continued to be bullied by mainstream school children and suffered an emotional blow when, toward the end of his adolescence, his grandfather died. The death of his grandfather greatly affected Pichushkin. He was forced to return to his mother's home, and in an effort to dull the pain of the loss and calm his severe aggressive tendencies, he began consuming large quantities of vodka. He continued playing chess both at home and in Bitsa Park, now joining the other men in drinking vodka. Though unlike them, he could play without being greatly affected by the alcohol. It was at this time that Pichushkin began developing a more sinister hobby. Whenever he knew he was going to come into contact with children, he would take a video camera and threaten them. On one occasion, that has since been made public, he held a young child by one leg, upside down, and said to the camera, "You are in my power now. I am going to drop you from the window, and you will fall 15 meters to your death." He would watch these videos repeatedly to reaffirm his sense of power and control. But by 1992, this practice had become insufficient to satisfy his urges. Russian media have speculated that Pichushkin was motivated in part by a gruesome competition with another notorious Russian serial killer, Andrei Chikatilo, who was convicted of killing 52 children and young women over a 12-year period. Pichushkin stated that his aim was to kill 64 people, the number of squares on a chessboard. He wanted to fill every square with a victim, creating a perfect pattern of death. Later, he recanted this statement, saying that he would have continued killing indefinitely had he not been stopped. Pichushkin's first murder occurred on July 27, 1992, when he was 18 years old. He arranged to meet his classmate, Mikhail Popkov, in Bitsa Park. They had allegedly planned together to kill 64 people. However, when they arrived at the meeting point, Popkov changed his mind and told Pichushkin he no longer wanted to be a part of his evil plans. Feeling betrayed and teased by his best friend, Pichushkin strangled him and threw his body into a sewer entrance at Bitsa Park. The body was never found. After Popkov's disappearance, Moscow police opened an investigation. Witness testimony stated that Popkov was last seen with Pichushkin, walking toward the park. Pichushkin was arrested and taken to the police station for questioning. When asked about the day of Popkov's disappearance, Pichushkin confirmed meeting with him, but claimed to have left him unharmed in the park. With no evidence tying him to the disappearance, police released him. Pichushkin stopped killing for several years. In 1996, when Russia placed a moratorium on the death penalty, his interest in killing was reignited. Without the threat of execution, the stakes had changed. On May 17, 2001, Pichushkin was playing chess in Bitsa Park with a 52-year-old man named Yevgeny Pronin. At the end of their game, Pichushkin invited Pronin to take a walk with him, claiming it was the anniversary of his dog's death and that he wanted to visit the grave in the park. Pronin agreed. Once they reached an isolated area, Pichushkin pulled out a bottle of vodka and offered Pronin a drink. The men toasted to the dog, and then Pichushkin struck Pronin in the head with the bottle. Once Pronin was dead, Pichushkin threw his body into a nearby well. Between May 2001 and September 2005, Pichushkin attacked 36 victims, though 3 survived their injuries. His method became ritualized. He would approach victims in Bitsa Park, usually elderly homeless people, and offer to share a drink of vodka. Once they were in an isolated location, he would attack them, typically by striking the back of their skull with a hammer or bottle. Sometimes he would push his victims into sewage canals to drown. He would then sign the corpse by impaling the victim's skull with sticks or an empty vodka bottle, leaving his trademark. From October 2005 to his final murder in 2006, Pichushkin's method changed. He became more brutal. He would kill his victims by repeated blows to the head with a hammer, then push a vodka bottle into the gaping wound in their skulls. He always attacked from behind to take the victim by surprise, and avoid spilling blood on his clothes. 10 of his victims lived in the same 4-building complex on Kersenskaya Street, where Pichushkin lived. Residents began to notice a pattern, but nobody connected the deaths to the quiet chess player who lived among them. Pichushkin's downfall came through his own carelessness. In June 2006, he offered to go for a walk with his 36-year-old co-worker, Marina Moskalyova. Though she was reportedly suspicious of him, she agreed. Before she left, she wrote a note to her son, letting him know she was with Pichushkin, and left his phone number. Pichushkin was aware of the note, but was undeterred by it. Moskalyova's body was discovered in Bitsa Park on June 14, 2006, complete with Pichushkin's trademark injuries. Authorities found a Moscow metro ticket in her possession and reviewed surveillance tape footage from the metro system. The footage showed Moskalyova, just hours before her death, walking on a platform accompanied by Pichushkin. Once apprehended, Pichushkin led police officers to the scenes of many of his crimes in Bitsa Park and demonstrated a keen recollection of how the murders were committed. He was filmed reenacting his crimes in great detail, a regular part of Russian criminal investigation. Pichushkin revealed that some murders were not committed using his preferred method of hammer blows, but by throwing victims down into sewer lines beneath Bitsa Park, though one victim survived this ordeal. During interrogation, Pichushkin claimed that deciding whether his victims should live or die made him feel like God. "In all cases, I killed for only one reason," he said. "I killed in order to live, because when you kill, you want to live. For me, life without murder is like life without food for you. I felt like the father of all these people, since it was me who opened the door for them to another world." Pichushkin's trial began in 2007. He was convicted on October 24th of 49 murders and 3 attempted murders. Throughout the trial, he was housed in a glass cage for his own protection. Upon conviction, Judge Vladimir Usov sentenced Pichushkin to life imprisonment, with the first 15 years to be spent in solitary confinement. Pichushkin appealed his sentencing, claiming it was too harsh and asking for a reduction to 25 years. His appeal was denied. He also asked a Russian court to add 11 additional victims to his body count, bringing his claimed total to 60, plus 3 surviving victims. These additional claims could not be verified with sufficient evidence. As of this writing, Pichushkin is spending his days in solitary confinement at the Arctic penal colony known as Polar Owl, one of the harshest prisons in the Russian system. The conditions there are severe, with long, dark winters and minimal human contact. Pichushkin will spend at least 15 years in complete isolation before being allowed to interact with other prisoners. What made Pichushkin particularly dangerous was his methodical approach and his ability to blend into his surroundings. He wasn't a stranger, but a familiar face in Bitsa Park, known for playing chess with elderly men. He would strike up conversations, offer companionship and vodka, and then kill without hesitation or remorse. His victims trusted him, and that trust was their undoing. The Pichushkin case also highlighted failures in the Russian criminal justice system. Many victims were homeless or elderly alcoholics, people on the margins of society, whose disappearances weren't immediately investigated. If authorities had responded more quickly to the pattern of deaths in Bitsa Park, lives could have been saved. But like many serial killers, Pichushkin exploited society's blind spots, targeting victims whose absence wouldn't trigger alarm bells. Alexander Pichushkin remains one of the most prolific serial killers in Russian history. Number 3, Mikhail Popkov from Russia, responsible for 89 to 90+ deaths. Mikhail Popkov from Russia, with 89 confirmed victims, and possibly 90 or more, stands as the single most prolific serial killer in Russian history, surpassing even Alexander Pichushkin and Andrei Chikatilo in his death toll. Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov was born on March 7, 1964, in Norilsk, Krasnoyarsk Krai, in what was then the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. Soon after his birth, his parents moved with him to Angarsk, in the Irkutsk Oblast region of Siberia. Little is known about his early life beyond the fact that he was married to a woman named Elena Popkova and had a daughter named Ekaterina. On the surface, Popkov appeared to be a normal family man, living an ordinary life. But beneath this facade lived a bloodthirsty monster. Angarsk psychiatrist Alexander Pichushkin would later speculate that growing up with an alcoholic and allegedly abusive mother likely contributed to Popkov's development as a killer. Whatever the roots of his pathology, by 1992, Popkov was ready to act on his violent impulses. From 1992 to 2011, Popkov killed dozens of women between the ages of 19 and 50, as well as one policeman, in his home city of Angarsk and other locations within the Irkutsk region. His motivation was chilling in its self-righteousness. He claimed he wanted to cleanse the streets of prostitutes and that committing the murders, he was guided by his inner conviction. He also falsely accused his wife of infidelity and claimed that his brutality was the result of this imagined betrayal. Popkov's occupation gave him both an opportunity and cover. He worked as a police officer in the Irkutsk region, and by the time of his capture, he had also spent time as a security guard at the Angarsk Oil and Chemical Company and at private firm. His police training taught him exactly how investigations worked, what evidence to avoid leaving, and how to exploit the system's weaknesses. Popkov targeted women who did things he considered immoral, such as going to parties without male chaperones or engaging in sex work. His usual tactic was calculated and effective. He would go out at night wearing his police uniform, find a potential victim, and offer them a lift in his police car. Most women would accept without hesitation. Why would they fear a police officer? The uniform represented safety and authority. They trusted him, and that trust was fatal. Instead of taking them to their destinations, Popkov would drive to remote locations. There, he would force his victims to disrobe before killing them with various tools, including knives, axes, baseball bats, and screwdrivers. After death, he would rape their bodies. He also mutilated them so severely that Russian media nicknamed him the Werewolf and the Angarsk Maniac. Another nickname emerged as investigators noticed a pattern. Most of the victims' bodies were found on Wednesdays, earning him the moniker the Wednesday Murderer. This detail suggested that Popkov operated on some kind of schedule, perhaps determined by his work shifts or family obligations. Russian police were involved in searching for the perpetrator, as slain women were discovered throughout the mid-1990s. Despite extensive inquiries and testimonies from surviving victims, Popkov eluded police for nearly 2 decades. His position as a police officer gave him inside knowledge of the investigation. He knew what police were looking for, what leads they were following, and how to stay one step ahead. However, investigators eventually discovered a pattern. Tracks from a Lada 4x4, an off-road vehicle used by law enforcement, were found at numerous crime scenes. This discovery narrowed the suspect pool significantly. The killer was likely someone with access to police vehicles. In 2012, authorities made a breakthrough. They conducted DNA testing of 3,500 current and former policemen in Irkutsk. This massive undertaking finally identified Popkov. His DNA matched evidence found at multiple crime scenes. On June 23, 2012, 20 years after his first known murder, Mikhail Popkov was arrested. In January 2015, Popkov was sentenced to life in prison for 22 murders and 2 attempted murders. But this was only the beginning. 2 years later, while already serving his life sentence, Popkov confessed to 59 additional killings. This brought his total victim count to a number that surpassed those of other notorious Russian serial killers. On December 10, 2018, after a trial in the regional court of Irkutsk in Siberia, Popkov was convicted of 56 of these additional murders. 3 other alleged killings could not be confirmed due to lack of evidence. He was given a second life sentence, ensuring he would never walk free again. But Popkov's confessions didn't stop there. In July 2020, he confessed to 2 more killings, bringing the total number of admitted victims to 83. Then, on June 4, 2021, he was found guilty of 2 more killings and sentenced to an additional 9 years and 8 months in prison. In November 2023, he was found guilty of 3 more killings and sentenced to another 10 years. His confirmed victim count now stands at 89, with strong suspicions that the actual number exceeds 90. The scale of Popkov's crimes is difficult to comprehend. For nearly 20 years, he prowled the streets of Angarsk and surrounding areas, killing women with impunity. Some estimates suggest he may have killed more than 100 women, though not all cases have been conclusively linked to him. What's certain is that he is the most prolific serial killer in Russian history, and possibly one of the most prolific in world history. There were calls for Popkov to be executed, but capital punishment in Russia is subject to a formal moratorium. The death penalty was suspended in 1996 and hasn't been carried out since. So instead of execution, Popkov faces multiple life sentences in one of Russia's harshest prisons, where he will spend the rest of his days isolated from society. The case exposed serious failures in the Russian law enforcement system. How did a police officer manage to kill dozens of women over 2 decades without being caught? Part of the answer lies in the victims he chose. Many were sex workers or women living on the margins of society. Their disappearances didn't trigger the same level of investigation that missing women from prominent families would have prompted. Society's prejudices and law enforcement's biases allowed Popkov to continue killing. Another factor was Popkov's inside knowledge. As a police officer, he understood forensic techniques and investigation procedures. He knew how to avoid leaving evidence, how to choose locations that would delay discovery of bodies, and how to exploit gaps in interjurisdictional cooperation. He used his uniform and authority to gain victims' trust, turning the very symbols meant to represent safety into tools of predation. The psychology behind Popkov's crimes reveals a man driven by a toxic mixture of misogyny, self-righteousness, and sexual sadism. His claim that he was cleansing the streets mirrors the justifications of other serial killers who targeted sex workers, including Peter Sutcliffe in England and Gary Ridgway in the United States. These killers convince themselves they're performing a service, ridding society of undesirable elements. It's a rationalization that allows them to dehumanize their victims and view murder not as a crime, but as a crusade. The Angarsk community was devastated by the discoveries. Residents had lived alongside a prolific serial killer for years, never suspecting that one of the officers sworn to protect them was actually preying on vulnerable women. The case shattered trust in local law enforcement and raised questions about vetting procedures and psychological evaluations for police officers. Mikhail Popkov's case stands as a dark chapter in Russian criminal history. His arrest and conviction brought some closure, but for the families of his victims and the communities he terrorized, the scars will never fully heal. Number 4. Ted Bundy from the United States of America killed approximately 30 to 100 people. Ted Bundy from the United States, with an estimated 30 to 100 victims, stands as one of America's most infamous killers. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. His early life was covered in deception. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, gave birth to him out of wedlock, and for the first 3 years of his life, he was raised by his grandparents as their son. Young Ted was told his mother was actually his older sister, a lie designed to shield the family from the social stigma of illegitimate birth. The truth about his parentage remained a mystery that would haunt him throughout his life. His biological father's identity was never confirmed, with various accounts pointing to different men, and some family members even suspected his own grandfather might have been responsible. When Bundy eventually discovered the truth about his parentage, he developed a lifelong resentment toward his mother for never telling him, and for leaving him to uncover the reality on his own. His childhood in the Roxborough neighborhood of Philadelphia showed early warning signs that went unnoticed or ignored. His Aunt Julia recalled a chilling memory. She woke from a nap to find herself surrounded by knives from the kitchen, with 3-year-old Bundy standing by the bed, smiling. Neighbors in Tacoma, where the family later moved, remembered him as a mean-spirited kid who liked to inflict pain and suffering. One neighbor claimed Bundy hung a stray cat from a clothesline and set it on fire with lighter fluid. He allegedly built makeshift traps around his neighborhood, injuring at least one girl. Yet Bundy could also present a completely different face to the world. By high school, Some classmates described him as well-known and well-liked, while others remembered him as shy and introverted. This ability to shift between personas, to become whoever he needed to be in any given moment, would become his most dangerous weapon. In college, Bundy met Diane Edwards, a woman he would later describe as the only woman he ever really loved. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and came from a wealthy family. Everything Bundy aspired to be. But in early 1968, Edwards ended their relationship, frustrated by what she saw as his immaturity and lack of ambition. The breakup devastated him. Many experts would later pinpoint this rejection as a pivotal moment in his development, the crack that would eventually tear him apart. After the breakup, Bundy dropped out of college and drifted east. He immersed himself in violent pornographic literature, nursing his wounds and his rage. When he returned to Washington in 1969, he was a different person. He was focused, driven, and hiding something dark beneath his charming exterior. He re-enrolled at the University of Washington as a psychology major, became an honor student, and even worked at a suicide hotline crisis center. There, he met Anne Rule, a former police officer turned crime writer, who would later pen one of the definitive biographies about him. Rule saw nothing disturbing in Bundy's personality at the time, describing him as solicitous and empathetic. He was so convincing that nobody suspected the monster prowling beneath the surface. Bundy also became active in Republican Party politics, working on campaigns and earning respect from prominent figures. He was accepted into law school, and on the surface seemed destined for a successful legal and political career. He even rekindled his relationship with Edwards in the summer of 1973, and she was amazed by his transformation. They discussed marriage, and he introduced her to colleagues as his fiancée. Then, in January 1974, Bundy abruptly ended all contact with Edwards. When she finally reached him by phone a month later, demanding to know why, he replied in a flat, calm voice, "Diane, I have no idea what you mean," and hung up. She never heard from him again. Bundy later explained that he just wanted to prove to himself that he could have married her, that he had waited all those years to be in a position where he could make her fall in love with him, so that he could drop her and reject her as she had rejected him. It was a cold and well-calculated revenge, but his revenge against Edwards was nothing compared to what he would do to others. Shortly after midnight on January 4, 1974, around the same time he terminated his relationship with Edwards, Bundy entered the basement apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks. He bludgeoned her with a metal rod from her bed frame, then sexually assaulted her with the same rod, causing extensive internal injuries. Sparks survived, but was left with permanent brain damage and significant loss of vision and hearing. On February 1st, Bundy broke into the basement room of 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy. He beat her unconscious, dressed her in clothes, and carried her away. He later stated that he drove her to a secluded area where he raped and murdered her. During the first half of 1974, female college students disappeared at the rate of about one per month. On March 12th, 19-year-old Donna Gail Manson vanished while walking to a concert. On April 17th, 18-year-old Susan Elaine Rancourt disappeared after an evening meeting. Two female students reported encounters with a man wearing a sling who asked for help carrying books to his brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. The pattern continued with Roberta Kathleen Parks in Oregon, Brenda Carroll Ball near Seattle, and Jorgen Hawkins in June. Each disappearance followed a similar pattern: young, attractive women with long hair parted in the middle, last seen in the company of a charming man who needed help. The Washington and Oregon murders culminated on July 14th with a brazen double abduction in broad daylight. At Lake Sammamish State Park, multiple witnesses saw an attractive young man wearing a white tennis outfit with his left arm in a sling, introducing himself as Ted and asking women to help him unload a sailboat from his Volkswagen Beetle. 3 women refused, but 23-year-old Janice Ann Ott accompanied him and was never seen alive again. About 4 hours later, 19-year-old Denise Marie Naslund disappeared from the same location. With detailed descriptions and composite sketches circulated throughout Seattle, Several people who knew Bundy reported him to police as a possible suspect, including his girlfriend, Elizabeth Klopfer. But detectives receiving up to 200 tips per day thought it unlikely that a clean-cut law student with no adult criminal record could be the perpetrator. Bundy had moved to Utah by August to attend law school. His killing spree continued with new victims in Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. He refined his methods, becoming more organized and sophisticated. He would wear casts or slings to appear vulnerable and harmless, ask for help, then overpower his victims near his vehicle. Once they were subdued, he would transport them to secondary locations, where he would rape and strangle them. His arrest came almost by accident. On August 16, 1975, Utah Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward stopped Bundy's Volkswagen in the early morning hours. A search of the car revealed a ski mask, handcuffs, crowbars, rope, and an ice pick. Though Bundy was initially released, Detective Jerry Thompson connected him to the attempted kidnapping of Carol Durank, who had escaped from a man claiming to be a police officer. In February 1976, Bundy stood trial for the Durank kidnapping. After a 4-day bench trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. While imprisoned, Colorado authorities charged him with the murder of Corinne Campbell, and he was transferred to Aspen for trial. On June 7, 1977, during a court recess, Bundy jumped from a second-story courthouse window and escaped. He was recaptured after 6 days of wandering the mountains, cold, injured, and exhausted. But on December 30, 1977, he escaped again, this time more successfully. He had sawed a hole in his cell ceiling over several weeks, and having lost 35 pounds to fit through the opening, he climbed through, changed into the jailer's clothes, and walked out the front door. Bundy made his way to Florida, where his final and most savage attacks would occur. In the early hours of January 15, 1978, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In less than 15 minutes, he attacked 4 women. He bludgeoned and garroted 21-year-old Margaret Bowman, beat and sexually assaulted 20-year-old Lisa Levy with a hair mist bottle and tore off one of her nipples, and severely beat Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, breaking their jaws. He then broke into another apartment and attacked 21-year-old Cheryl Thomas, fracturing her skull and jaw in 5 places. On February 9th, Bundy committed his final known murder. He abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from her junior high school in Lake City, Florida. 7 weeks later, her partially mummified remains were found in an abandoned pig shed. Her throat had been cut and her body mutilated. Bundy was arrested on February 15th after being stopped for a traffic violation. When the officer ran a check on the vehicle, it came back stolen. Bundy kicked the officer's legs out from under him and tried to escape but was tackled and subdued. In the vehicle were stolen credit cards and identification belonging to Florida State University students. His trials were among the first to be nationally televised. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, including bite mark analysis that matched his teeth to wounds on Lisa Levy's body, Bundy maintained his innocence. He was found guilty and sentenced to death 3 times, twice for the Chi Omega murders and once for the Leach killing. During his time on death row, Bundy finally began to confess. He spoke to investigators, FBI agents, and journalists, revealing horrific details about his crimes. He admitted to killing at least 30 women, though he hinted the number was much higher. He described how he would revisit the bodies of his victims, sometimes lying with them for hours, grooming them, applying makeup, washing their hair. He kept severed heads in his apartment for periods of time. He told investigators that possession was the ultimate goal. By taking their lives and keeping parts of their bodies, they became permanently his. Bundy also revealed his motivations in chilling terms. He explained that he needed to be extremely drunk while hunting victims in order to sedate his dominant personality and allow his darker impulses to act. He admitted that he targeted young, attractive women, not because they reminded him of his ex-girlfriend, as many theorized, but simply because youth and beauty were absolutely indispensable criteria in his victim selection. On January 24, 1989, Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. His last words were directed at his attorney and a Methodist minister. "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." Hours before his execution, He had called his mother to apologize, saying, "I'm so sorry I've given you all such grief, but a part of me was hidden all the time." Hundreds of people celebrated outside the prison as the execution was carried out, cheering as the hearse containing his body departed. Even in death, Ted Bundy continued to fascinate many people. Anne Rule, who had worked alongside him at the suicide hotline, wrote that, even in death, Ted damaged women. She received letters from numerous intelligent young women who were deeply depressed because Bundy was dead, many of whom had corresponded with him, believing they were his only love. They were conned by the master con man to the very end. Bundy's true victim count remains unknown. He hinted at numbers far higher than 30, telling one FBI agent to add one digit to their estimate of 36. He told others he had killed more than 75 women. Several cold cases remain unsolved where Bundy is the prime suspect, including the 1961 disappearances of 8-year-old Anne Marie Burr, whose house was on Bundy's newspaper delivery route when he was 14 years old. What made Ted Bundy so terrifying was not just the number of his victims, but his ability to hide in plain sight. He was handsome, charming, intelligent, and ambitious. Exactly the kind of person nobody would suspect of being a monster. Bundy's case also highlighted serious flaws in law enforcement coordination. He killed across multiple states, and the lack of communication between jurisdictions allowed him to continue his rampage for years. Multiple people reported him as a suspect early on, but those reports weren't taken seriously until it was too late. His crimes led to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies share information and track serial offenders. Psychologists and criminologists have studied Bundy extensively, trying to understand what created such a prolific killer. Most concluded he suffered from antisocial personality disorder, with strong narcissistic traits and a complete absence of empathy or remorse. When asked about guilt, Bundy responded, "Guilt doesn't solve anything, really. It hurts you. I guess I am in the enviable position of not having to deal with guilt." On the day before his execution, Bundy granted an interview to psychologist James Dobson, where he blamed his crimes on pornography and violence in the media. Most experts dismissed this as one final manipulation, an attempt to shift blame away from himself. Throughout his life, Bundy never accepted responsibility for his actions. The fault was always with someone else: his grandfather, his absent father, his mother for lying to him, alcohol, pornography, and the society he was living in. Even when offered plea bargains that would have spared him the death penalty in exchange for confessions, he refused because it would have required him to stand up and admit his guilt to the world. Ted Bundy remains one of the most studied serial killers in history, not because his victim count was the highest, but because of what his case revealed about the nature of psychopathy, the failures of the justice system, and society's blind spots when it comes to recognizing predators who don't fit our preconceived notions of what a killer should look like. If you believe the truth matters more than appearances, let me know what you think below. How do we spot monsters who hide behind charm and good looks? Number 5. Jeffrey Dahmer. From the United States of America, killed as many as 17 people. Jeffrey Dahmer from the United States with 17 confirmed victims represents one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history, not because of the number alone, but because of the depravity of his crimes. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His father, Lionel, was a chemistry student who would become a research chemist, and his mother, Joyce, worked as a teletype machine instructor. From the outside, the Dahmers appeared to be a typical middle-class family, but beneath the surface, dysfunction festered. Some sources report that Dahmer was deprived of attention as an infant, though others suggest he was actually doted upon by both parents initially. What's clear is that his mother, Joyce, suffered from depression and was described as a hypochondriac who demanded constant attention. She attempted suicide at least once using Equinil. Neither parent devoted much time to their son, and Dahmer later recollected that from an early age he felt unsure of the solidity of his family, remembering extreme tension and numerous arguments between his parents. Dahmer had been an energetic and happy child, but something changed after he underwent double hernia surgery shortly before his 4th birthday. He became notably subdued, quiet, and timid. As he grew older, his behavior became increasingly troubling. His fascination with dead animals began early. At age 4, he watched his father remove animal bones from beneath their house and became oddly thrilled by the sound the bones made. He began collecting animal bones, exploring the bodies of live animals to discover where their bones were located. By the time the family moved to Bath Township, Ohio, Dahmer had progressed from collecting bones to actively killing animals. He would dissect his kills and bury the remains beside a small hut near their house, sometimes placing the skulls atop makeshift crosses. In one instance in 1975, he decapitated a dog and nailed its body to a tree, then impaled the skull on a stick. He later invited a friend to view the display, claiming he had discovered the remains by chance. His father, Lionel, pleased by what he believed was his son's scientific curiosity, taught him how to safely bleach and preserve animal bones. Lionel had no idea he was providing his son with skills that would later be used on human victims. Meanwhile, Joyce's mental health deteriorated. She began increasing her daily consumption of Equineal, laxatives, and sleeping pills, further increasing her emotional distance from her husband and children. During his freshman year at Revere High School, Dahmer was seen as an outcast. By age 14, he had begun drinking beer and hard alcohol during daylight hours, frequently concealing liquor inside his jacket at school. When a classmate asked why he was drinking whiskey in a morning history class, Dahmer shrugged and said the alcohol was his medicine. He was mercilessly teased by classmates, who would pour cold water on him as he showered in privacy in a stall, avoiding the open showers where other students bathed together. Yet Dahmer also developed a reputation as a class clown who often staged pranks that became known as doing a Dahmer. These included bleeding, simulating epileptic seizures, or mimicking cerebral palsy at school and in local stores. He would sometimes perform these antics for money to purchase more alcohol. When Dahmer reached puberty, he discovered he was gay, but he didn't tell his parents. He began fantasizing about dominating and controlling completely submissive male partners. These fantasies gradually became intertwined with dissection. By age 16, he had conceived a fantasy of rendering unconscious a particular male jogger he found attractive, then making sexual use of his body. On one occasion, he concealed himself in bushes with a baseball bat, waiting for this jogger, but the man didn't pass by that day. Dahmer later admitted this was his first attempt to attack someone. By 1977, Dahmer's grades had declined sharply. His parents' marriage was falling apart, with increasingly bitter arguments about their impending divorce. In early 1978, Lionel moved out temporarily. That spring, Joyce moved out with Dahmer's younger brother David, leaving 18-year-old Jeffrey alone in the family home. On June 18, 1978, just 3 weeks after his high school graduation, Dahmer committed his first murder. He picked up 18-year-old hitchhiker Stephen Mark Hicks, who was on his way to a rock concert. Dahmer invited him back to the house for beer and music. According to Dahmer, the sight of the bare-chested Hicks stirred his sexual feelings, though when Hicks began talking about girls, Dahmer knew any sexual passes he made would be rebuffed. After several hours, Hicks wanted to leave, but Dahmer didn't want him to go. He bludgeoned Hicks with a 10-pound dumbbell, then strangled him to death with the bar of the dumbbell. He stripped Hicks' clothes, explored his chest with his hands, then masturbated standing over the corpse. The next day, Dahmer dissected Hicks' body in the basement. He buried the remains in his backyard, then later unearthed them, pared the flesh from the bones, dissolved the flesh in acid, crushed the bones with a sledgehammer, and scattered them in the woods. This pattern of dismemberment and disposal would become his signature. After the murder, Dahmer attempted to continue with normal life. He enrolled at Ohio State University, but his persistent alcohol abuse made his sole term there completely unproductive. He received failing grades in almost every class. In January 1979, at his father's urging, he enlisted in the Army. He served as a combat medic in Germany, but his off-duty drinking caused him to be deemed unsuitable for military service, and he was discharged in March 1981. After his Army discharge, Dahmer eventually moved to Wisconsin to live with his grandmother in West Allis. Initially, his living arrangements were harmonious. He accompanied her to church, did chores, and actively sought work. In early 1982, he found employment as a phlebotomist at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center, though he was laid off after 10 months. Dahmer's grandmother provided stability for a time, but his inner darkness was only dormant, not cured. In August 1982, he was arrested for indecent exposure at the Wisconsin State Fair. In September 1986, he was arrested again for masturbating in the presence of two 12-year-old boys near a river. He claimed he had merely been urinating, but soon admitted the offense. On November 20, 1987, Dahmer committed his second murder. He met 25-year-old Stephen Tuomi at a bar and persuaded him to get a room at the Ambassador Hotel. Dahmer claimed he only intended to drug Tuomi and lie beside him, but when he woke up the next morning, Tuomi was dead beneath him, his chest crushed and bruised. Dahmer had no memory of killing him. He purchased a large suitcase, transported the body to his grandmother's house, and spent the next week dismembering it. He disposed of everything except the head, which he kept wrapped in a blanket for 2 weeks before boiling it in a mixture of industrial detergent and bleach. According to Dahmer, Tuomi's murder was a pivotal incident, after which he did not try to control his compulsions. He began actively seeking victims, most of whom he encountered in or around gay bars. He would lure them to his grandmother's home, drug them with sleeping pills, strangle them, then dismember their bodies. In January 1988, he killed 14-year-old James Dockstader. In March, he murdered 22-year-old Richard Guerrero. In September 1988, Dahmer's grandmother asked him to move out because of his drinking, the habit of bringing young men to her house late at night, and the foul smells. He found an apartment and shortly after was arrested for drugging and sexually fondling a 13-year-old boy. He was sentenced to probation and a year in a house of correction with work release. In March 1989, while still awaiting sentencing, Dahmer murdered 24-year-old Anthony Sears. This was the first victim from whom he permanently retained body parts. He preserved Sears' head and genitals in acetone and stored them in a wooden box in his work locker. After serving his sentence, Dahmer moved into apartment 213 at 924 North 25th Street. This unassuming apartment would become the site of his most prolific killing spree. Between May 1990 and July 1991, he murdered 12 more men there. His method became increasingly ritualistic. He would meet men, usually at gay bars, and offer them money to come back to his apartment to pose for photographs or simply to keep him company. Once there, he would give them drinks laced with sleeping pills. When they became unconscious, he would strangle them, then photograph their bodies in various poses. He would then dismember the corpses in his bathtub, often keeping the skulls, which he would bleach and paint. Dahmer also engaged in extensive acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. He admitted to having sex with the corpses, sometimes for hours or days after death. He preserved hearts, livers, and other organs in his refrigerator and freezer, some of which he later ate. He told investigators he would tenderize the body parts and prepare them as meals flavored with various condiments. When asked why he consumed his victims, Dahmer said, "I suppose, in an odd way, it made me feel they were even more a permanent part of me." In some cases, Dahmer attempted to create living zombies, compliant sex slaves, who would never leave him. He would drill holes into victims' skulls and inject hydrochloric acid or boiling water directly into their brains. The case that nearly ended Dahmer's killing spree occurred on May 27, 1991. He had lured 14-year-old Konarek Synthesomphone to his apartment, drugged him, and injected acid into his brain. While Synthesomphone was unconscious, Dahmer left to buy more beer. The boy woke up disoriented and managed to escape outside, where 3 young women found him naked and bleeding. They called 911. When police officers John Balcerzak and Joseph Gabrish arrived, Dahmer was there and calmly explained that Synthesomphone was his 19-year-old boyfriend who had drunk too much after a quarrel. Despite the women insisting something was wrong, despite the boy's inability to speak coherently, and despite blood on his genitals and rectum, the officers escorted Dahmer and Synthesomphone back to Dahmer's apartment. Inside, Dahmer showed them Polaroid photos of Synthesomphone in his underwear to prove they were in a relationship. The officers noted nothing unusual. though one later said he smelled something odd. They left Synthesamphone with Dahmer. If the officers had looked more carefully, they would have seen the body of Tony Hughes, whom Dahmer had killed 3 days earlier, decomposing in the bedroom. Instead, they left, making a joke about reuniting the lovers. As soon as they were gone, Dahmer injected more acid into Synthesamphone's brain, killing him. He then dismembered the body and kept the skull. Dahmer's reign of terror finally ended on July 22, 1991. He approached 32-year-old Tracy Edwards with an offer of money to come to his apartment. Edwards agreed, but once inside, he noticed a foul odor and boxes of acid. When Dahmer tried to handcuff him and threatened to eat his heart, Edwards realized he was in mortal danger. He waited for an opportunity, then punched Dahmer and ran outside, flagging down police officers Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller. The officers returned to apartment 213 with Edwards. When Dahmer couldn't produce a key to remove the handcuffs, Officer Mueller went into the bedroom to look for one. There, he found Polaroid photographs of dismembered bodies and body parts in various stages of decay. They were clearly taken in the same apartment where they were standing. Dahmer tried to fight the officers, but they quickly subdued him. A search of the apartment revealed a chamber of horrors. In the refrigerator, they found a severed head on the bottom shelf. In the bedroom and closet, they found 7 skulls, some painted and some bleached. They discovered a severed hand, 2 human hearts wrapped in plastic, a portion of arm muscle, an entire torso in the freezer, and human organs stuck to the ice. In a 57-gallon drum, they found 3 more torsos dissolving in acid. A total of 74 Polaroid photographs documented the dismemberment of his victims in graphic detail. During his interrogation, Dahmer waived his right to an attorney and confessed to everything. He admitted to killing 17 men between 1978 and 1991. He described his methods in chilling detail: the drugging, the strangling, the necrophilia, the dismemberment, and the cannibalism. He explained that he kept skulls and bones because he was building a private altar, a shrine where he could sit in a black leather chair surrounded by his victims' remains, feeling their presence, feeling powerful. Dahmer's trial began in January 1992. He pleaded guilty but insane, and the trial became a debate over whether he suffered from mental illness that prevented him from controlling his actions. Defense experts testified he was driven by uncontrollable necrophiliac urges. Prosecution experts argued he was perfectly sane and simply chose to commit horrific acts to satisfy his desires. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours before finding Dahmer sane and guilty of 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, later receiving a 16th term for the Stephen Hicks murder in Ohio. The death penalty was not an option, as Wisconsin had abolished capital punishment in 1853. In prison, Dahmer initially requested solitary confinement for his own safety, but after a year, he asked to be moved to the general population. He was assigned to clean toilets and the prison gymnasium. He gradually devoted himself to Christianity and was baptized by a Church of Christ minister named Roy Ratcliffe in May 1994. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer's life ended violently. He was assigned to clean the prison showers, along with 2 other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. They were left unsupervised for about 20 minutes. Scarver, who was serving life for murder and suffered from schizophrenia, attacked Dahmer and Anderson with a 20-inch metal bar, severely beating both men. Dahmer was discovered on the floor with extreme head wounds. He was rushed to a hospital, but pronounced dead an hour later. According to Scarver, he attacked Dahmer because God told him to do it. He later said that Dahmer's final words were, "I don't care if I live or die. Go ahead and kill me." Scarver claimed he was adamant that he had not planned the attack, although he had concealed the metal bar in his clothing before the incident. The response to Dahmer's death was mixed. Some victims' families celebrated, while others were saddened because they felt cheated out of getting answers. Catherine Lacey, the mother of victim Oliver Lacey, said, "The hurt is worse now because he's not suffering like we are." Dahmer's case shocked America not just because of the number of victims, but because of the extreme depravity of his crimes. The cannibalism, the necrophilia, the attempts to create zombie sex slaves, and the keeping of body parts as souvenirs. These details revealed a level of psychological disturbance that few could comprehend. Psychologists diagnosed Dahmer with various conditions, including borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and a psychotic disorder. But he was found legally sane. The consensus was that he knew right from wrong and could control his actions, but chose not to. His compulsion to possess his victims completely, to make them a permanent part of himself, drove him to acts of unimaginable horror. What's perhaps most disturbing about the Dahmer case is how many opportunities there were to stop him. The boy who escaped only to be returned to him by police, the smell of decomposing bodies that neighbors complained about repeatedly, the fact that he was on probation for child molestation while killing most of his victims. The system failed again and again, and people died as a result. The case also highlighted issues of racism and homophobia in law enforcement. Many of Dahmer's victims were young men of color from marginalized communities. When Konarak Synthesomphone escaped, the officers who returned him to Dahmer made homophobic jokes and failed to take the concerns of the three women seriously. If they had investigated properly, they would have saved Synthesomphone's life and prevented 5 more murders. Dahmer himself acknowledged the racial composition of his victims, but insisted race was incidental to his victim selection. He claimed he was attracted to a certain body type, and that most of his victims happened to be from minority backgrounds. However, the fact remains that he deliberately chose vulnerable individuals who were less likely to be missed or whose disappearances were less likely to prompt intensive investigations. In death, Dahmer's body was cremated and his ashes divided between his parents. His brain, which was initially retained for study, was also eventually cremated after his parents disagreed about whether it should be used for research. The apartment building where he committed most of his murders was demolished in November 1992. The site is now a vacant lot. Jeffrey Dahmer's case continues to fascinate and horrify people decades later. It represents not just the story of one man's descent into depravity, but a broader commentary on how society treats its most vulnerable members and how the justice system can fail when prejudice clouds judgment. Hit the like button, comment, and subscribe to this channel if you believe the police should have done better. Should those officers have faced consequences for returning that boy to his death? Number 6. Daniel Camargo Barbosa, from Colombia. Responsible for 72 to 180 murders. Daniel Camargo Barbosa from Colombia, with 72 confirmed victims, and possibly as many as 180 stands as one of South America's most prolific and disturbing killers. A predator whose crimes spanned 2 countries and left a trail of young victims in his wake. Daniel Camargo Barbosa was born on January 22, 1930, in Anolima, Cundinamarca, Colombia. His childhood was plagued by trauma and abuse. His mother died before he reached the age of 1, and his father remarried a woman named Dioselina Fernandez, who had fertility problems. This new stepmother became abusive to Daniel, humiliating him in ways that would leave deep psychological scars. She dressed him up as a girl and forced him to go to school that way. His peers and classmates made fun of him mercilessly. Despite this humiliation, Daniel stood out as a great student at the Leon 13 school in Bogota, with a reported IQ of 116. His intelligence offered a glimpse of what he might have become under different circumstances, but his desire to continue studying was hampered when he was forced to drop out of school to help his family financially. He was first arrested in Bogota in 1958 for petty theft. This early brush with the law was just the beginning. Camargo eventually had a common law marriage with a woman named Alcira and had 2 children with her. Later, he fell in love with another woman named Esperanza, who was 28 years old, and planned to marry her. But then he discovered that she was not a virgin, and this discovery became the root of Camargo's fixations and the spark that would ignite his killing spree. He and Esperanza formed a twisted agreement. He would stay with her if she aided him in finding other virgin girls to rape. Thus began a period of their partnership in crime. Esperanza became Camargo's accomplice, luring young girls to an apartment under false pretenses, then drugging them with sodium seconal sleeping pills so that Camargo could assault them. Camargo committed 5 rapes this way, but initially, he did not kill any of the girls. However, the 5th girl they abused reported the crime, and both Camargo and Esperanza were arrested and taken to separate prisons. On April 10, 1964, Camargo was convicted of sexual assault in Colombia. A judge initially sentenced him to 3 years in prison, and Camargo was grateful for what he perceived as lenient treatment. He swore to repent and mend his ways. But then a new judge was assigned to the case, and Camargo's sentence was increased to 8 years. This provoked him to rebellious anger. He served his full sentence and was released, but the seeds of rage had been planted in his mind. In 1973, he was arrested in Brazil for being undocumented. Due to a delay in sending Camargo's criminal records from Colombia, he was deported and released with a false identity. When he returned to Colombia, he took up a job as a street vendor in Barranquilla, selling television monitors. One day, while passing by a school, he kidnapped a 9-year-old girl. This time, he murdered her after raping her so that she could not inform the police as his previous victim had done. This was his first known assault involving murder, and it marked a turning point. Camargo had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Camargo was arrested on May 3, 1974, in Barranquilla, Colombia, when he returned to the scene of the crime to recover the television screens he had left beside the victim. Even though it is believed he raped and killed more than 80 girls in Colombia, Camargo was only convicted of raping and killing that 9-year-old girl. He was initially sentenced to 30 years in prison, but this sentence was reduced to 25 years, and he was sent to the prison on Gorgona Island on December 24, 1977. Gorgona Island was known as the Colombian Alcatraz, a maximum security prison located off Colombia's Pacific coast. The prison was surrounded by shark-infested waters and dense jungle, making escape seem impossible. But Camargo was determined. For years, he carefully studied the ocean currents, watching the water, learning its patterns, while planning his escape with meticulous attention to detail. In November 1984, Camargo made his move. He escaped from Gorgona prison in a primitive boat, navigating the treacherous waters using his knowledge of the currents. The authorities assumed he died at sea, and the press reported that he had been eaten by sharks. But Camargo survived. He eventually arrived in Quito, Ecuador, beginning a new chapter of horror in a country where nobody knew his face or his crimes. He traveled by bus to Guayaquil, arriving on December 5th or 6th, 1984. On December 18th, he abducted a 9-year-old girl from the city of Quevedo in the province of Los Rios, Ecuador. The next day, a 10-year-old girl also disappeared. The pattern had resumed, but in a new country where police had no idea they were dealing with an escaped Colombian serial killer. From 1984 to 1986, Camargo committed a series of at least 54 rapes and murders in Guayaquil. The police initially believed all the deaths were the work of a gang, unable to comprehend that one man could have killed so many. Camargo slept on the streets and lived off money he gained by reselling ballpoint pens. Occasionally, he supplemented his income by selling clothing or small valuables belonging to his victims. Camargo's method of selecting victims was calculated and predatory. He targeted helpless young lower-class girls who were searching for work. He would approach them pretending to be a foreigner who needed to find a Protestant pastor in a church on the outskirts of town. He explained that he had to deliver a large sum of money, which he showed them as proof, and he offered them a reward if they would accompany him to show him the way. He pretended to be a stranger to the area and hinted at the possibility of the girls getting a job at a factory. This promise of employment was irresistible to poor girls, desperate to help their families. No one was suspicious of an older man accompanying a girl or young woman who could be his granddaughter. They looked like a grandfather and grandchild walking together, not a predator and his prey. Camargo would then enter into the woods, claiming to be looking for a shortcut in order to avoid arousing suspicion in his victims. If the girls grew suspicious and drew back, he did not prevent them from leaving. He only wanted victims who would follow him deep into isolated areas. Once they were far from help, he would rape them before strangling them. Sometimes he would stab them when they resisted. After his victims were dead, he left their bodies in the forest. On February 26, 1986, Camargo's reign of terror finally ended. He was arrested by 2 policemen in Quito, only minutes after he had murdered a 9-year-old girl named Elizabeth. The policemen were on patrol and approached him, thinking he was acting suspiciously. They found that he was carrying a bag containing the bloody clothes and clitoris of his latest victim, and a copy of Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. He was taken into custody and later moved to Guayaquil for identification. When arrested, he gave a false name, Manuel Bulgarin Solis, but he was later identified by Maria Alexandra Velez, one of his rape victims who had escaped. Faced with evidence and identification, Daniel Camargo calmly confessed to killing 72 girls in Ecuador since escaping from the Colombian island prison. He led authorities to the dumping grounds of those victims whose bodies had not yet been recovered. The bodies had been dismembered. While he told the Ecuadorian authorities the locations of the bodies and how the crimes were committed, he showed no feelings of remorse. After raping his victims, he had hacked, slashed, and crushed the girls with a machete. Investigators were stunned by his clinical detachment. He gave a cynical explanation for choosing children. He wanted virgins because they cried, and this apparently gave him greater satisfaction. According to Camargo, he killed because he wanted revenge on women's unfaithfulness. He hated them for not being what he believed women were supposed to be. His twisted logic blamed all women for the perceived betrayal of his former lover Esperanza not being a virgin. In June 1986, Francisco Febres Cordero, a journalist for the newspaper Hoy, managed to arrange an interview with Camargo. It was difficult to get the interview due to police blocking all access to Camargo, and the fact that Camargo himself demanded a large fee before he would allow himself to be interviewed. The journalist pretended to be part of a group of psychologists who were allowed access to the prisoner, allowing him to ask Camargo searching questions without arousing his suspicion. Camargo was convicted in 1989 and sentenced to 16 years in prison, the maximum sentence available in Ecuador at that time. While serving his sentence at the Garcia Moreno de Quito jail, he claimed to have converted to Christianity. In this penitentiary, he was imprisoned alongside Pedro Alonso Lopez, also known as the Monster of the Andes, who is believed to have raped and killed as many as 300 girls in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. The fact that 2 of South America's most prolific serial killers were housed in the same prison is a distressing historical footnote. On November 13, 1994, Daniel Camargo Barbosa's story came to a violent end. He was stabbed to death in prison by Giovanni Noguera, who was the nephew of one of his victims. Camargo was 64 years old at the time of his death. For the man who killed him, it was an act of vengeance, a settling of accounts that the justice system had failed to fully provide. The case of Daniel Camargo Barbosa exposed troubling realities about justice and punishment in South America. He had been convicted and imprisoned in Colombia for raping and murdering a child, yet he was able to escape and continue his crimes in another country. The maximum sentence in Ecuador meant that even after confessing to 72 murders, he would have been released after serving just 16 years. This inadequacy of the legal system to deal with serial killers of such magnitude raised serious questions about victim justice and public safety. Camargo's victim count remains disputed. He confessed to 72 murders in Ecuador, but investigators believe he killed at least 80 girls in Colombia before his first imprisonment. Some estimates place his total victim count as high as 150 to 180. The true number will never be known, as Camargo took many secrets to his grave. What made Camargo particularly dangerous was his ability to exploit societal loopholes. He understood that poverty made his victims vulnerable in ways that went beyond physical weakness. Their economic desperation made them willing to trust a stranger offering employment, even if that meant following him into isolated areas. Camargo's escape from Gorgona Island prison revealed serious flaws in the Colombian penal system. A convicted child rapist and murderer was able to study ocean currents for years, build a boat, and escape one of the country's most secure facilities. The assumption that he had died at sea meant that no alert was sent to neighboring countries, allowing him to establish himself in Ecuador and resume killing without anyone connecting the new murders to the escaped Colombian prisoner. Camargo's claim of religious conversion while in prison in Ecuador was met with skepticism by many who studied his case. Serial killers often claim to have found God or undergone spiritual transformation, particularly when facing long sentences or execution. These claims can be genuine in some cases, representing a true reckoning with their crimes, but they can also be manipulative attempts to gain sympathy or early release. In Camargo's case, his lack of remorse during his confession and his cynical explanations for his crimes suggest that any conversion was superficial at best. Daniel Camargo Barbosa's case remains one of the most horrific in South American history. His 72 confirmed murders in Ecuador, combined with the estimated 80 or more in Colombia, place him among the most prolific serial killers in the world. His crimes exposed the susceptibility of poor children in societies with limited social services and the inadequacy of justice systems to deal with predators of such magnitude. Like, subscribe, and let me know if you think justice fell short here. Should closed countries warn each other when inmates escape from prison? Number 7. Samuel Little from the United States of America. Killed between 60 to 93 people. Samuel Little from the United States, with 60 confirmed victims and 93 confessed murders, stands as America's most prolific serial killer, a predator who operated in the dark for nearly 4 decades, targeting society's most vulnerable and forgotten women. Samuel Little was born Samuel McDowell on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia. Census records from the year he was born listed his mother, Bessie May, as working as a maid, with his father recorded as 19-year-old Paul McDowell. Little later said that his teenage mother was a lady of the night, and that she abandoned him as an infant. Soon after his birth, Little's family moved to Lorain, Ohio, where he was brought up mainly by his grandmother. By his own account, Little began having sexual fantasies about strangling women as a child, starting when he saw his kindergarten teacher touch her neck. As a teenager, he collected true crime magazines depicting the strangulation of women. These early fixations would eventually evolve into a decade-long killing spree that would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. In 1956, after being convicted of breaking and entering in Omaha, Nebraska, Little was held in an institution for juvenile offenders. His mother was listed on the booking card as whereabouts unknown. Little moved to Florida to live with his mother in the late 1960s. By his own account, he worked various jobs, including as a cemetery worker and an ambulance attendant. He said he then began traveling more widely and had more run-ins with the law, being arrested in 8 states for crimes including driving under the influence, fraud, shoplifting, solicitation, armed robbery, aggravated assault, and rape. Little took up boxing during his time in prison, referring to himself as a former prizefighter. In 1961, Little was sentenced to 3 years in prison for breaking into a furniture store in Lorain. He was released in 1964. By 1975, he had been arrested 26 times in 11 states for various crimes. Despite this extensive criminal record, he managed to avoid serious consequences for his most violent acts for decades. In 1982, Little was arrested in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and faced charges for the murder of 22-year-old Melinda Rose Lepre, who had gone missing in September of that year. A grand jury declined to indict him. However, while under investigation, Little was extradited to Florida and tried for the murder of 26-year-old Patricia Ann Mount, whose body had been found in September 1982. Prosecution witnesses identified Little in court as someone who had spent time with Mount the night before her disappearance. Due to mistrust of witness testimonies, Little was acquitted in January 1984. Little moved to California, where he stayed in the vicinity of San Diego. In October 1984, he was arrested for kidnapping, beating, and strangling 22-year-old Lori Barros, who survived. 1 month later, he was found by police in the back seat of his car with an unconscious woman, also beaten and strangled, in the same location as the attempted murder of Barros. Little served 2.5 years in prison for both crimes. Upon his release in February 1987, he immediately moved to Los Angeles and committed at least 10 additional murders. For the next 25 years, Little continued to kill, moving from state to state, targeting susceptible women who lived on the margins of society. Little was finally arrested on September 5, 2012, at Wayside Christian Homeless Shelter in Louisville, Kentucky. He was extradited to California to face a narcotics charge. While in custody, authorities used DNA testing to establish that he was involved in the murders of 3 women in Los Angeles. Linda Alford, killed on July 13, 1987. Audrey Nelson Everett, killed on August 14, 1989. And Guadalupe Duarte Apodaca, killed on September 3, 1989. All 3 women were killed and later found on the streets of Los Angeles. Little was tried for these 3 murders in September 2014. The prosecution presented DNA evidence and testimony from witnesses who had been attacked by Little at different times throughout his criminal career. On September 25, 2014, Little was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. On the day of the verdict, Little continued to insist on his innocence. But in November 2018, something noteworthy happened. Little, now in his late 70s and in failing health, began confessing to murders across the country. On November 9th, he confessed to the 1996 fatal strangulation of Melissa Thomas. On November 13th, he was charged with the 1994 murders of Denise Christie Brothers in Odessa, Texas. He pleaded guilty to Brothers' murder on December 13th and received another life sentence. The confessions continued to pour out. On November 13th, 2018, the Ector County, Texas District Attorney and Wise County Sheriff's Office announced that Little had confessed to dozens of murders and may have committed more than 90 across 14 states between 1970 and 2005. He confessed to murders in Russell County, Alabama, Macon, Georgia, Harrison County, Lee County, Mississippi, Richland County, South Carolina, Marion County, Florida, and many other locations across the United States. On November 27, 2018, the FBI announced that a violent criminal apprehension program team had confirmed 34 of Little's confessions and was working to match the remainder to known murders or suspicious deaths. Little began making the confessions in exchange for a transfer out of the Los Angeles County prison where he was being held. He wanted better conditions, and he was willing to trade information about his victims for comfort in his final years. What made Little's confessions particularly valuable was his remarkable memory. Despite being in his 70s, suffering from diabetes, heart problems, and other health conditions, Little could recall details about his victims with stunning clarity. He drew portraits of many of the women he killed, sketches that proved instrumental in solving cold cases across the country. At least 26 of these portraits were released by the FBI in hopes of identifying the victims. The sketches were hauntingly accurate, created from memory decades after the murders. Little's method was consistent throughout his killing spree. He targeted vulnerable women, mostly sex workers, substance users, or homeless individuals. He thought these women would leave fewer clues for authorities and fewer people would search for them. He was largely correct. Many of his victims were never reported missing, and their deaths were often attributed to drug overdoses, accidents, or natural causes rather than homicide. Little's primary method of killing was strangulation. He would knock women unconscious with punches to the head, then strangle them while they were helpless. His boxing background made his punches devastatingly effective. Victims often died without leaving obvious signs of homicide, particularly if their bodies weren't discovered immediately. This allowed Little to avoid detection for decades. Little described his crimes in chilling detail during his confessions. He spoke about the hunt for victims, cruising areas where vulnerable women congregated. He talked about how he selected them based on their isolation and lack of connections to people who would report them missing. He explained his killing method with precision, describing how long it took to strangle someone, what it felt like, what his victims did. The FBI ultimately confirmed Little's involvement in at least 60 murders, making him the most prolific serial killer in American history by number of confirmed victims. However, Little confessed to 93 murders, and investigators believe most, if not all of these confessions are credible. The discrepancy between confirmed and confessed murders reflects the difficulty of matching decades-old confessions to cases where bodies were never found. Evidence was lost, or deaths were never investigated as homicides. Little's victims came from 19 states, spanning from Washington to Florida, from California to Ohio. Many were African American women, though Little also killed white and Hispanic women. The racial composition of his victims reflected both the demographics of the areas where he operated and his deliberate targeting of marginalized communities where murders were less likely to be thoroughly investigated. Some of Little's confirmed victims include Annie Lee Stewart, 32, murdered in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 1981. Mary Jo Payton, 21, murdered in Cleveland, Ohio, in 1984. Carol Linda Alford, 41, murdered in Los Angeles in 1987. Audrey Nelson, Everett, 35, found in a dumpster in Los Angeles in 1989. Guadalupe Apodaca, 46, found at an abandoned auto repair shop in Los Angeles in 1989. Zena Marie Jones, 30, murdered in Memphis, Tennessee in 1990, though her body was found in Arkansas. Rose Evans, 32, murdered in Cleveland, Ohio in 1991. Denise Christie Brothers, 32, murdered in Odessa, Texas. In 1994, each of these women had families who loved them, lives that mattered, and dreams that were cut short. But because of their circumstances, their deaths went unsolved for years or decades. Society had written them off, and Little exploited that indifference. During his confessions, Little was interviewed extensively by cold case detectives from across the country. They traveled to the California prison where he was held, bringing case files and hoping for answers. Little would sometimes cooperate fully, providing details that only the killer could know. Other times, he would be evasive or claim he couldn't remember. He used his confessions as bargaining chips, trading information for better prison conditions, for transfers, and for attention. Gillian Lauren, an author who interviewed Little extensively, spent more than 40 hours talking with him. During these interviews, he confessed to multiple murders and sent her drawings of his victims. Lauren initially planned to write a mystery novel, but switched to nonfiction after learning about Little from an LAPD detective. Her work helped bring Little's story to public attention and aided in solving cases. Joe Berlinger, a documentary filmmaker, read Lauren's article and produced a 5-part television miniseries called Confronting a Serial Killer that premiered in April 2021. The series presented Lauren's investigation and included recordings of her conversations with Little. Little's personal life included a long-term relationship with Aurelia Dorsey, a woman who supported them both through shoplifting for years. Dorsey died of natural causes in Los Angeles in 1988. Other women were part of his life at various times, including Lucy Madero, who later testified against him in a robbery case, and the information passed on by Dorsey helped his defense team and led to his acquittal. On December 30, 2020, Samuel Little died in a Los Angeles County area hospital at the age of 80. Although California Department of Corrections sources indicated no specific cause of death, Little suffered from diabetes, heart problems, and other health conditions. His death ended one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history, but it also meant that many questions would never be answered. Several of his confessed murders remain unconfirmed, and families still wait for closure. The FBI has created a website dedicated to Little's victims, featuring his sketches and asking for the public's help in identifying women who remain nameless. This effort represents an attempt to restore dignity to victims who were stripped of it in life and death. Each sketch represents a woman whose life mattered, whose death deserves recognition, whose name should be remembered. Number 8, Harold Shipman from the United Kingdom, killed between 215 to 260 people. Harold Shipman from the United Kingdom stands as Britain's most prolific serial killer and possibly the most prolific medical killer in modern history. He was a trusted doctor who betrayed his oath and murdered hundreds of elderly patients under his care. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, on the Bestwood Estate, a council estate in Nottingham, England. He was the second of 3 children born to Harold Frederick Shipman Sr., a lorry driver, and Vera Britton. His working-class parents were devout Methodists, who instilled in their children the values of hard work and respectability. Shipman was particularly close to his mother, who died of lung cancer when he was 17 years old. Her death came in a manner eerily similar to what would later become Shipman's modus operandi. In the later stages of her disease, she had morphine administered at home by a doctor. Shipman witnessed his mother's pain subside, despite her terminal condition, as the morphine took effect, until her death on June 21, 1963. This experience would profoundly shape his future crimes. On November 5, 1966, Shipman married Primrose May Oxtoby. The couple would have 4 children together. Shipman studied medicine at Leeds School of Medicine, University of Leeds, graduating in 1970. From the outside, he appeared to be a successful, dedicated physician, building a respectable career. Shipman began working at Pontefract General Infirmary, and in 1974 took his first position as a general practitioner at the Abraham Ormerod Medical Center in Todmorden. But the following year, in 1975, Shipman was caught forging prescriptions of pethidine for his own use. He was fined £600 and briefly attended a drug rehabilitation clinic in York. Despite this setback, Shipman was able to continue practicing medicine. In 1977, he worked as a GP at Donnybrook Medical Center in Hyde, Greater Manchester. Shipman continued working as a GP in Hyde. Throughout the 1980s and in 1993 established his own surgery at 21 Market Street, becoming a respected member of the community. Patients loved him. He seemed caring, attentive, and thorough. Many elderly patients specifically requested him as their doctor. But underneath the surface of this respected physician was a serial killer unlike any Britain had seen before. Shipman was killing his patients, mostly elderly women, by injecting them with lethal doses of diamorphine, commonly known as heroin. He would visit patients at their homes, often alone, and administer the fatal injection. Then he would falsify medical records to indicate the patients had been in poor health and their deaths were expected. In March 1998, Linda Reynolds, a general practitioner at the Brooks Surgery in Hyde, expressed concerns to John Pollard, the coroner for the South Manchester district, about the high death rate among Shipman's patients. She was particularly concerned about the large number of cremation forms for elderly women that he had asked to have countersigned. The Greater Manchester Police investigated, but were unable to find sufficient evidence to bring charges. The investigation was closed on April 17, 1998. The Shipman inquiry would later blame the police for assigning inexperienced officers to the case. After the investigation was closed, Shipman killed 3 more people. A few months later, in August, taxi driver John Shaw told police he suspected Shipman of murdering 21 patients. Shaw had become suspicious because many of the elderly customers he took to the hospital, while seemingly in good health, died in Shipman's care. Shipman's downfall finally came through his own greed and arrogance. On June 24, 1998, his last victim, Kathleen Grundy, a former mayoress of Hyde, was found dead at her home. Shipman was the last person to see her alive. He later signed her death certificate, recording the cause of death as old age. Grundy was 81 and had been healthy and active. Grundy's daughter, solicitor Angela Woodruff, became concerned when fellow solicitor Brian Burgess informed her that a will had been made, apparently by her mother, with doubts about its authenticity. The will excluded Woodruff and her children, but left £386,000 to Shipman. At Burgess's urging, Woodruff went to police. Grundy's body was exhumed and found to contain traces of diamorphine. Shipman claimed Grundy had been an addict and showed investigators comments he had written to that effect in his computerized medical journal. However, police examination of his computer showed that the entries were written after her death. This clumsy forgery was Shipman's undoing. Shipman was arrested on September 7, 1998. Police found he owned a Brother typewriter of the type used to make the forged will. Investigators then looked into other deaths that Shipman had certified and discovered a horrifying pattern. He had been administering lethal doses of diamorphine to patients, signing their death certificates, then falsifying medical records to cover his tracks. An abnormally large number of deaths occurred around the same time of day. When Shipman was on his afternoon visits, and in the doctor's presence. In 2003, after Shipman's conviction, statistician David Spiegelhalter and others analyzed his mortality rates. They found that Shipman's rates had been broadly in line with national rates between 1988 and 1994, but started increasing in 1995. Statistical monitoring could have raised an alarm by the end of 1996, when there had already been 67 excess deaths of Shipman's female patients aged over 65. By 1998, when suspicions were first raised, the number had reached 119. Shipman's trial began at Preston Crown Court on October 5, 1999. He was charged with the murders of 15 women by lethal injections of diamorphine, all between 1995 and 1998. The victims were Marie West, Irene Turner, Lizzie Adams, Jean Lilly, Ivy Lomas, Muriel Grimshaw, Marie Quinn, Kathleen Wagstaff, Bianca Pomfret, Nora Nuttall, Pamela Hillier, Maureen Ward, Winifred Meller, Joan Melia, and Kathleen Grundy. On January 31, 2000, after 6 days of deliberation, the jury found Shipman guilty of all 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. Judge Forbes sentenced Shipman to life imprisonment on all 15 counts of murder, with a recommendation that he be subject to a whole life tariff, meaning he would never be released. He also received a sentence of 4 years for forging Grundy's will. On February 11, 2000, 11 days after his conviction, Shipman was struck off the medical register by the General Medical Council. 2 years later, Home Secretary David Blunkett confirmed the judge's whole life tariff. While authorities could have brought many additional charges, they concluded that a fair hearing would be impossible given the enormous publicity surrounding the original trial, and that the 15 life sentences already imposed rendered further litigation unnecessary. Shipman denied his guilt throughout, disputing the scientific evidence against him. He never made any public statements about his actions or motivations. His wife, Primrose, maintained that he was not guilty even after his conviction, standing by him despite the overwhelming evidence. On January 13, 2004, the day before his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman hanged himself in his cell at HM Prison Wakefield. A post-mortem examination was performed, and an inquest was opened. His suicide divided opinion. Some victims' families felt cheated, as Shipman's death meant they would never have the satisfaction of a confession or answers about why he committed his crimes. Home Secretary David Blunkett later admitted that celebration was tempting. You wake up and you receive a call telling you Shipman has topped himself, and you think, is it too early to open a bottle? And then you discover that everybody's very upset that he's done it. The Shipman Inquiry, submitted in July 2002, concluded that Shipman had killed at least 218 of his patients between 1975 and 1998, during his time practicing in Todmorden and Hyde. Judge Janet Smith, who conducted the inquiry, said there were further deaths about which there was so little evidence that a conclusion on whether they were unlawful killings could not be reached. Most of his victims were elderly women in good health. In her 6th and final report, issued on January 24, 2005, Smith reported that she believed Shipman had killed 3 patients during the early stage of his medical career at Pontefract General Infirmary, and she had serious suspicions about 4 further deaths, including that of a 4-year-old girl. In total, 459 people died while under his care between 1971 and 1998, but it is uncertain how many were murder victims. Smith's estimate of Shipman's total victim count over that 27-year period was 250. The question of why Shipman killed remains partially unanswered. Unlike many serial killers, he didn't kill for sexual gratification or obvious financial gain, except in the Grundy case. Some theories suggest he enjoyed the power over life and death, the godlike ability to decide who lived and who died. Others propose he had a compulsion to relieve suffering, twisted by his witnessing his mother's pain and the relief morphine brought her. Still others think he simply enjoyed killing and found elderly patients to be easy targets. The Shipman case led to significant changes in medical practice in the United Kingdom, now referred to as the Shipman effect. Death certification practices were altered. Many doctors reported changes in their dispensing practices, though some worried that a reluctance to risk overprescribing pain medication might lead to underprescribing for patients who genuinely needed it. The forms needed for cremation in England and Wales had their questions altered as a direct result of the case. Perhaps the largest change was the movement from single doctor general practices to multiple doctor general practices. The inquiry found there was not enough safeguarding and monitoring of doctors' decisions when they worked alone. Shipman's ability to operate for so long was partially due to his working in isolation, with nobody questioning his decisions or noticing patterns in his patients' deaths. After Shipman's body was released to his family, it remained in Sheffield for more than a year. His widow was advised by police against burying her husband in case the grave was attacked. The body was eventually cremated at Hutcliffe Wood Crematorium in Sheffield, attended only by Shipman's widow and the couple's 4 children. The Shipman case raises disturbing questions about the nature of evil. How does a person who takes an oath to do no harm become someone who kills hundreds of vulnerable patients? How does someone maintain a normal family life while secretly committing mass murder? How does a community recover when it discovers that a trusted physician has been systematically killing patients for decades? Number 9. Pedro Lopez from Colombia. Killed between 110 to 300 people. Pedro Lopez, nicknamed Monster of the Andes, is from Colombia, with at least 110 proven victims and claims of over 300 stands as one of history's most prolific serial killers. He was a predator whose crimes spanned 3 countries and whose current whereabouts remain unknown, making him perhaps the most dangerous fugitive in the world. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born on October 5, 1948, in Tolima Department, Colombia. He was the 7th of 13 children born to Benilda Lopez de Castañeda, a laundry worker. The family formerly lived in Saldaña, where his father Medardo Reyes, a rancher, was murdered 6 months before Lopez's birth in an ambush shooting while defending a neighboring hamlet during La Violencia, Colombia's civil war. Benilda fled to her mother's home in El Espinal, where she remained bedridden with grief until her son's birth. Lopez claimed he had a difficult childhood due to the violence of the household and the absence of a father. He characterized his mother as a prostitute who was only good for putting children into this world, each from different men, and stated he often saw his mother and stepfather have sex in front of him. Childhood neighbors stated that Lopez's mother was strict and often forbid him from playing with them. His mother later said her son's hatred of her manifested early, with Lopez often telling her directly that he couldn't stand her while still a young child. According to Lopez, he was banished from the house at age 8 when his mother caught him groping the chest of his sister. He subsequently spent time homeless around Tolima for about a year, during which time he was raped by a man who had lured him to a house with the false promise of shelter and food. His mother claimed she never took notice of any abnormal behavior from Lopez, and that he ran away from home on his own accord on April 5, 1958, in an act of rebellion against her, presumably because he didn't want to live with his mother any longer. Regardless of the circumstances, Lopez relocated to Bogotá at age 10, where he joined a gang of street children for protection. Through them, he began using drugs to stave off the ill effects of malnutrition. While begging around the city, Lopez was occasionally sexually assaulted. At age 12, he was adopted by an American immigrant family, but ran away the same year after stealing money from them. Lopez claimed he fled because a male teacher at the orphan's school had sexually harassed him, while later biographers suggest that no such incident occurred, and that Lopez left because he felt unable to trust his adoptive family after previous negative experiences. In 1969, Lopez was sentenced to 7 years in prison for auto theft. 2 days after arriving at La Modelo prison, he was raped by 4 other inmates. Lopez did not report the assault. Instead, he killed 3 of the rapists with a makeshift knife over the course of 2 weeks. While the killings were described as self-defense and considered such by prison staff, his sentence was nevertheless extended by 2 years. This was Lopez's introduction to murder, and it would not be his last. After his release in 1978, Lopez began wandering throughout the northwestern area of South America. According to Lopez, he usually stayed in Bogotá and would traverse the departments of Tolima, Huila, Cauca, and Nariño to enter Ecuador, through which he would pass into Peru. To acquaintances, he claimed to do migrant work. He later claimed that between 1978 and 1980, he had killed over 100 girls, mainly street children, and those from indigenous tribes. While these claims are unverifiable, it is known that Lopez was briefly captured by indigenous Peruvians in the Ayacucho region after attempting to abduct a 9-year-old girl from her village. The villagers beat Lopez for several hours before stripping him of his clothes and burying him up to his neck in sand. Most reports state their intention was to kill Lopez through live burial, although he would later claim they had poured syrup on him so ants would eat him alive. However, an American missionary convinced them to release Lopez and turn him over to the police. The police did not detain Lopez. Instead, they expelled him from the country. This decision would prove catastrophic. Lopez simply moved his operations to Ecuador, where authorities were unaware of his crimes in Peru. After his deportation from Peru, Lopez resumed his killing spree in Ecuador. Although authorities began to notice an increase of missing persons, particularly young girls. Throughout areas where he traveled, they concluded the disappearances were most likely cases of human trafficking rather than murder. On May 5, 1979, Lopez met Hortensia Garcés Lozada in Ambato as she was selling newspapers. He gave the girl 100 sucres to follow him and raped and killed her under a nearby bridge. On December 14, 1979, while in his hometown of El Espinal, Lopez raped and murdered Flor Alba Sanchez. Also, in El Espinal, there were 2 other murders of young girls on December 21, 1979 and January 3, 1980. On January 10, 1980, Lopez abducted Ivanova Jacome at a parking lot in Totoras, a suburb of Ambato, as she was heading to school. Jacome was raped and murdered in a nearby shack, with her body being discovered at Ambato's Plaza Urbina on February 15th. Lopez was frequently spotted at Plaza Urbina, claiming to be a fellow street merchant, but he was usually seen frequenting market stalls manned by young girls, offering them a 100 sucre banknote if they accompanied him. He typically claimed to need a city guide or directions to a bus stop. He was often seen listening to newspaper vendors, who read aloud the newest developments on the mounting cases of child disappearances, bearing a crooked grin. Even when he didn't talk with children at the market, Lopez was easily identified in crowds due to his tall stature, prominent nose, lack of upper front teeth, and a large scar on his right cheek. In early 1980, 2 young vendors, florist Luz Marina Lozada and beverage vendor Marina Cuenca, were left alone after declining Lopez's money, but they informed merchants of Lopez's behavior, believing he might be a child trafficker. On March 9, 1980, Lopez tried to abduct 9-year-old Carmen Lozada, but her cries alerted bystanders, and Lopez fled without the girl. Carmen identified Lopez as the man who had previously offered her sister Luz Marina money. One of the first people who reached the scene, the plaza's merchant board president Carolina Roman Poveda, ran around the market trying to rally other merchants to search for the attempted kidnapper. She was ignored because of heavy business, with some saying she was being paranoid due to the news. Roman followed Lopez out of the market and caught him talking to another 9-year-old girl, claiming to be a lost visitor and offering 100 sucres to be guided around, which the girl accepted. Roman intervened as Lopez was leading the girl to a secluded path, shouting that Lopez was going to sell the child, and threw herself on Lopez. Bystanders were initially inclined to believe Lopez, who claimed ignorance and called Roman crazy. However, due to her insistence and the fact that she said Lopez had already tried to kidnap 2 other girls, the crowd was convinced to bring Lopez back to the plaza. Lopez was brought to a police station, but was released shortly after. In April, the areas surrounding Ambato were hit by flash flooding, unearthing the remains of 4 more young girls who had been previously reported missing. The bodies bore signs of strangulation, prompting police to reopen their investigations. 3 days after the flood, Lopez approached 12-year-old Marina Roman Poveda, daughter of Carolina Roman Poveda, who was working at the Plaza Rosa market. Lopez flirted with the girl and offered her 100 sucres to show him around the city, but she refused. She told her mother Carolina of Lopez's advances, and recognizing Lopez, Carolina screamed at him and grabbed him by the arm. She told bystanders that Lopez had tried to abduct her daughter and was potentially responsible for the murders of the recently discovered girls. Local merchants overpowered Lopez and held him until police arrived. While in police custody, Lopez initially refused to cooperate during interrogation, choosing to remain silent. Eventually, he began confessing his crimes to police captain Pastor Cordova Gudino, who posed as a fellow prisoner and shared a cell with Lopez for 27 days. Lopez boasted that in total, he had murdered 100 in Colombia, at least 110 in Ecuador, and many more in Peru. He described his method of operation. He would lure victims away from public spaces with trinkets, money, candy, or job offers, then rape and strangle them with his bare hands for around 15 minutes. He additionally claimed that he would occasionally exhume victims' bodies from their burial sites and have tea parties with them. When asked about his motive, Lopez reportedly said, "I lost my innocence at age 8, so I decided to do the same to as many girls as I could." Because police voiced doubts about the authenticity of his confession, Lopez offered to direct authorities to sites where he had buried some victims. This led to the discovery of the bodies of 53 girls, aged 8 to 13, in a forest near Ambato. While another 28 sites named by Lopez did not yield any human remains, police attributed this to scavenging animals, unearthing and scattering the body parts. Given the discovery of the mass grave, his estimate of 110 murders in Ecuador was accepted as legitimate. In 1980, Lopez's trial began at the court of Ambato. On January 27, 1981, he was found guilty of 57 counts of murder. Lopez received a sentence of 16 years, the maximum prison sentence available in Ecuador at the time. For 57 murders, 16 years meant each life was valued at approximately 3 months of imprisonment. Lopez served his prison sentence at the Garcia Moreno prison near Quito. He was frequently subject to knife attacks by fellow inmates, leading to increased security for him. Throughout the early 1990s, Lopez was often interviewed by journalists and usually made contradictory statements about the murders. Lopez bragged about the rush he felt when strangling victims, but at other times claimed he was only an accomplice to the actual perpetrator, a man named Jorge Patiño. His projected release date was controversial, with numerous lawyers petitioning for an extension of his sentence or additional convictions. He was released from prison 2 years early, on August 31, 1994. In an interview shortly before his release, Lopez described himself as the man of the century and said he was being released for good behavior. From Quito, Lopez was transported to Ibarra, where a judge ordered his deportation. Members of the press and public were present, with Lopez shaking hands with several people. After the deportation order was read, police seized Lopez and took him to a different vehicle, driving around for 5 hours until nightfall to lose any potential pursuers, as the families of his victims had placed several bounties on Lopez, the highest being $25,000. In Colombia, Lopez was received by authorities, but since there was no warrant against him, police had to temporarily keep him at a hotel in Pasto. After a week, an arrest warrant was issued from El Espinal. He was convicted of the murder of Flor Alba Sanchez, but a physician believed Lopez showed signs of psychosis requiring psychological treatment. The diagnosis was challenged, and Lopez was sent to the psychiatric ward of La Modelo prison. In February 1998, Lopez was declared sane and released on bail equivalent to $70, on the condition that he would periodically report to authorities and attend appointments with his therapist. He almost immediately absconded. Within the year, Lopez visited his mother to ask for money, but after she rejected this due to her own poverty, he took her mattress and a chair from the home and sold them on the street before leaving. The last reported sighting of Lopez was on September 22, 1999, when he visited the National Civil Registry in Bogotá to renew his citizenship card. He had used the identity card of a 60-year-old man to bypass checkpoints. In 2002, Colombian National Police and Interpol issued warrants for Lopez's arrest over a murder bearing similarities to his methods. The Interpol warrant was deactivated in 2005 based on a claim that an abandoned corpse had been identified as Lopez, but this identification has been disputed. Lopez remains a fugitive and is considered extremely dangerous. For the families of Lopez's victims, the lack of closure is agonizing. Many bodies were never found. Many victims were never identified. The girls Lopez claimed to have killed in Colombia and Peru remain largely unaccounted for. Their families may never know what happened to their daughters, may never have the opportunity to lay them to rest properly. Like this video, subscribe, and tell us how this case makes you feel. Did the law handle Lopez's case carelessly despite all the evidence that was available? Number 10. Pedro Rodrigues Filho from Brazil. Killed over 71 people. Pedro Rodrigues Filho, known as Pedrinho Matador, or Killer Petey, was officially convicted of 71 murders, though he claimed to have killed over 100 people. What makes his story truly extraordinary is that he didn't target the innocent. His victims were drug dealers, rapists, murderers, and criminals, making him less of a traditional serial killer and more of a self-appointed executioner. Pedro's story began with violence before he even took his first breath. Born on October 29, 1954, his skull was damaged when his father kicked his pregnant mother during a fight. This prenatal injury may have been the first domino in a chain of events that would create Brazil's most infamous killer. Growing up in Santa Rita do Sapucaí in the southern region of Minas Gerais, Pedro witnessed brutal domestic violence throughout his childhood, watching helplessly as his father terrorized his mother. At just 13 years old, Pedro claimed he first felt the urge to kill during a fight with an older cousin. When punched in the face, he looked up from the ground and promised, "I'm going to kill you." His cousin laughed, not believing the threat. Pedro then pushed him into a sugarcane press, nearly severing his arm completely, before pulling a knife on him. But his true descent into murder began at 14. When Pedro's father, a school security guard, was fired and jailed over accusations of stealing food from the school kitchen, Pedro took his grandfather's shotgun and shot the deputy mayor of Santa Rita do Sapucaí right in front of City Hall. He then tracked down and killed the security guard he believed was the actual thief. Now a wanted teenager, Pedro fled to Mogi das Cruzes in Greater São Paulo. But instead of hiding, he transformed into something the media had never seen before, a vigilante serial killer. He began robbing drug dens and killing drug traffickers, earning celebrity status as Pedrinho Matador, or Little Pedro the Killer. During this time, Pedro met and fell in love with Maria Aparecida Olimpia, nicknamed Botinha. She was the widow of a local drug lord, and Pedro stepped into her deceased husband's shoes, becoming entangled in gang warfare. They began building a life together. Botinha became pregnant with his child. For a brief moment, it seemed Pedro might have found something worth living for beyond vengeance. Then tragedy struck. A rival gang murdered Botinha while she was still carrying their unborn child. The grief and rage that consumed Pedro was absolute. Still underage, he embarked on a revenge-killing spree, methodically tracking down and killing every single member of the rival gang responsible for her death. On May 24, 1973, at just 18 years old, Pedro was arrested for the first time. Even during his transport to prison, his killing didn't stop. Handcuffed in a police vehicle with another prisoner, he killed the man without officers noticing. When they discovered the body, Pedro coldly explained, "I did it because he was a rapist." Prison didn't stop Pedro Rodrigues Filho. It became his hunting ground. Reports suggest that he killed approximately 47 people while imprisoned, all of whom he deemed unworthy to live. He killed other inmates he identified as murderers, rapists, and child abusers, becoming a sort of prison executioner. Pedro was described by psychiatrists as the perfect psychopath, though some preferred to classify him as a sociopath. Despite being sentenced to 126 years in prison, Brazilian law at the time prohibited anyone from serving more than 30 years. After 34 years behind bars, Pedro was released on April 24, 2007. But his freedom didn't last. In 2011, he was arrested again and sentenced to 8 years for riot and deprivation of liberty charges related to crimes committed while detained. He was released in 2018 after 7 years on good behavior. Pedro Rodrigues Filho went on to becoming a YouTuber. He created a channel called Pedrinho Ex Matador, where he commented on modern crimes and campaigned against gang violence, attempting to teach the public not to be proud of criminal acts. Declaring himself reborn through Jesus Christ, he told his audience, "The crime is not a game. Many enter it because they see fame and money, but they don't see the roots, prison and death." His channel attracted hundreds of thousands of subscribers who were fascinated by his transformation. Pedro's story had already inspired popular culture long before his YouTube career. Author Jeff Lindsay based the character of Dexter Morgan on Pedro when he began writing his novel series in 2004, following Pedro's scheduled 2003 release. The book spawned the hit Showtime television series that ran from 2006 to 2013 and was revived in 2021, earning Pedro the international nickname, the Brazilian Dexter. But Pedro Rodrigues Filho's story has a dark ending. On March 5, 2023, at approximately 10 a.m., the 68-year-old was shot and killed by assailants firing from a car outside a family member's home in Mogi das Cruzes. One attacker finished him with a knife to the throat, in a wound so deep it nearly decapitated him. The killers reportedly told Pedro's relative, "It's nothing to do with you. Take your daughter and go inside." The car was found, but no arrests have ever been made. The hunter had become the hunted. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's legacy remains controversial. Was he a vigilante hero who only killed those who deserved it? Or was he simply a serial killer who found a convenient justification for his bloodlust? The answer likely lies somewhere in between. A damaged child who became a monster, hunting other monsters in an endless cycle of violence. And there you have it, the 10 deadliest serial killers in history, collectively responsible for over 1,000 deaths. From the frozen wastelands of Russia to the favelas of Brazil, these individuals remind us that true evil knows no borders, no boundaries, and no limits. But here's the thing about studying these cases. It's not about glorifying violence or celebrating death. It's about understanding the darkness that exists in our world so we can better recognize it, prevent it, and protect ourselves and our communities from it. Every one of these victims had families, dreams, and futures that were stolen from them. We remember the killers' names, but we must never forget the countless innocent lives they destroyed. If this video opened your eyes to the importance of awareness, vigilance, and the value of human life, then please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that the monsters in our world aren't always the ones in horror films. Sometimes they're walking among us. Drop a comment below and let us know. Which case shocked you the most? And remember, if you or someone you know is struggling with violent thoughts or needs help, please reach out to mental health professionals in your area. Breaking cycles of violence starts with each of us. And please always stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember that evil only triumphs when good people do nothing.
I want to thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you're going to love what's coming next. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for instant updates on our latest videos. See you in the next one.